Okay, here we go. Welcome back, I guess. So before we get into things today, I just wanted to make a note on some things that some people were posting about yesterday in the, today actually for me, because this is being recorded on Friday. After section, people were posting back on the forum. Someone mentioned that there's this weird continuous thing that Orlando Bloom has for like saving the people, in this modern democratic sense, where such a lord like himself would never have considered that. And this kind of goes back to. I just wanted to make a note of this because this is a kind of a thing that comes up with members of the alt-right or members of kind of the far right, or sovereign citizens, if you've heard of the term, who kind of trace their ability to not have to listen to any laws back to the Magna Carta, which is an agreement signed between King John, Richard's brother, and his barons, which was essentially just a guarantee that nobles had the right to not suffer anyone to annoy them, but kind of gets used in really weird ways. And we see this actually in one of Ridley Scott's other movies, which is his Robin Hood, which is all about the signing of the Magna Carta. And so there's a weird parallel there between proto-democracies. I think we talked about this a little bit way back, when we talked about how people went back and tried to find freedom figures in the Middle Ages, like, what's his name? The Braveheart. I can't remember. Or William Wallace. There we are. William Wallace. People like that in the Middle Ages. And the Magna Carta and kind of the people, the kind of the doing it for the people is part of that. And so I just wanted to make a note. All right, so this is our second deep dive into a subject that starts this week. The first was the Crusades. There are several reasons. This week it will be a deep dive into the, as the title page suggests, history of the religious history of the Middle Ages. And there's several reasons why I've chosen this as the kind of the second of the two deep dive subjects for the medieval side. There's going to be a third one, which is going to be a deep dive into contemporary academic politics, which is very inside baseball, but I think will be kind of interesting. And there's a lot of reasons why I've chosen kind of to look at religious history. First, I am in the end a religious historian. That's what I do. So this is the things I'd like to talk about. Second, the state of religious education, and particularly Catholic religious education about the Middle Ages and pre-Protestant Christianity is pretty weak in the United States, if it's ever covered at all. And so this fills in a gap there. And third, as the Crusades studying the Crusades imparted, understanding medieval religiosity is really, 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 really important for understanding anything in the Middle Ages. And fourth and finally, medieval religion is just weird. It's fun and weird, and people think it's like this stuffy, boring thing with people chanting, and you'll see. It's weird. So this week, this lecture will be a general overview of religious history of the Latin West. And this 2 weeks is going to be this week is going to be 2 lectures, both of which are going to cover the religious history of the Latin West. This one is going to talk about the institutional structures of the church, and the next one is going to talk about specific forms and changes in manifestations of piety, like how people decided to be religious. This lecture is about the structures in which they were religious. Right. And your readings map onto that. One of your readings is what's called a vita, which is simply the Latin word for life, which is written circa 1250. This is a life of a woman named Christina that is written by a priest, by Thomas of Canterbury, I believe. And the other is a work of fantasy/science fiction. This was one of those pieces that blurs the line between those two things, that uses religious history, and actually a lot of the structures I'm going to talk about today, as the core conceit behind its structure. So without knowing anything about, the more you know about medieval monasticism, the more sense the Canticle for Leibowitz makes, which is a selling point for your book, right? Yeah. Anyway, so next week we're going to talk about later medieval religiosity. It's kind of some of the weird ways it changes and shifts. And then the final week of this 3-week kind of section, we're going to talk about modern reception of religion in the Middle Ages, of medieval religion, right? And then the last 2 weeks after that, the last kind of section is again going to be on the past about 10 years of the way medieval studies has changed quite rapidly, in fact. So, in the beginning, the universe was created, and this made a lot of people very angry and has widely been regarded as a bad move. Circa the year 1, that is 1 AD or 1 CE, which are the same thing, which kind of makes my point that I made last week about secularism pretty strongly, right? Just normative Christianity in disguise. Circa the year 1, there's no year 0, by the way. It goes from -1 to 1. That's it. 1 BC, 1 AD. Around the year 1, there was probably a boy born who, in later life, would refer to himself as Jesus. And be subtitled by some people who followed him, Christ, which is the Koine Greek word Christos, which means the anointed one. Listen, chrism is another word that is a word that we actually use in English sometimes, very rarely. That comes from the same root. He probably looked a little bit like this. Maybe not with quite such a puzzled expression on his face. Anyway, this is a very interesting reconstruction. We can go into that in section if you really want. We can also probably accept that this guy, Jesus, was crucified as a rebel and a brigand by the Roman Empire. We also know that he formed a strong cult of followers within the Jewish community in Palestine, several of whom wrote stories of his life and the wisdom he tried to impart over the next 100 years, so between about 30 CE and 100 CE. Some of these texts are in the modern Bible. But in this way, Jesus is not unusual for this period. There are a lot of messiahs, or people claiming to be the Messiah, a lot of people dispensing religious wisdom in this period. And it's important to note that the texts we have for Jesus' life are mostly written in Koine Greek, which is to say the commonly spoken language in the Mediterranean basin. Not in Latin, not in Hebrew, Koine Greek. The spread and interest and general kind of adoption of Christianity throughout the Mediterranean basin probably can be blamed on this guy, who is always depicted with a huge forehead and a little tuft on the front. This is Paul of Tarsus, otherwise known as Saint Paul. He is never met Jesus, according to a biblical story. He's sort of the replacement apostle for Judas, who is the apostle who betrayed Jesus, and left him to be crucified, and then himself committed suicide. Paul was a missionary in several senses. He is the one who expanded Christianity as a cult, which is to say a small private religion of insiders, which is kind of how that term is used. We're going to use the term cult these days, and I don't want you to think of like people poisoning themselves with Kool-Aid yet. The kind of the Christian cult, he expanded it outside of the traditional kind of Jewish community in which it originated. He's also responsible in a way for a lot of the problems with Christian. Some people say like Paul ruined Christianity, and I don't think they're wrong. He's responsible or attributed many of the letters that follow the 4 Gospels and then the Acts of the Apostles in the Bible, in the current Bible, are written by Paul, are attributed to Paul, Not all of them are written by the same person. We can tell that. There seems to be two different people, at least, writing the letters of Paul, and all those injunctions against homosexuality and stuff like that. They come from the guy who probably wasn't Paul. They come a little bit later. Anyway, that's an interesting thing, which definitely didn't cause fights at my in-laws' dinner table. From circa 100 to 300, after Paul had done his bit, Christianity was occasionally heavily persecuted. And this is because the Christians, as well as the Jews, being monotheists, refused to make a sacrifice to the emperor, who was considered in the Roman Empire a divine being. The Jews had special dispensation not to do this. The Christians, because they were claiming not to be Jews, did not have that special dispensation. And therefore the emperor did not have much tolerance for this. And the usual response, if you will not sacrifice to the emperor, is that you will be executed. And so there are a bunch of people who are martyred in this period. That is martyrdom. Martyr is the Greek word. It means witness. They use their body as a witness for their religion, as it were. More on that next week. That's very important to Christianity, but this is when it's happened, mostly between 100 and 300. And these martyrs almost entirely are Greek-speaking, the Greek part of the world. Then, on the 28th of October, 1312, as Emperor Constantine I, this guy looking quite regal and relaxed, as he was preparing to battle his rival emperor, whose name is Maxentius, Constantine supposedly receives a divine command to paint a cross with a P for Greek letter, so Christos, paint basically a cross on his soldiers' shields. He orders them to do so, as the story goes, and the soldiers win the battle. At this point, Christianity becomes an accepted religion within the empire. Some stories say that Constantine converts. Some say that he converts to Christianity on his deathbed. Neither of these seem to have a lot of factual evidence behind them. But Christianity becomes an accepted religion, and because Constantine has respect for Christianity, having won this battle, whether or not he himself is a Christian, and because it is now this religion that is very popular within the empire, he finally decides that it needs to have some organization to it. So he calls all the kind of bishops together, who had never really kind of come to see each other because persecution, had written letters, but to a council at a place called Nicaea, which is in Anatolia, right outside of Constantinople. He calls this council in 325. And this council does two major things that we have to care about. First is doctrinal standardization across all kind of Christianity. This is the thing called the Nicene Creed. If you are Catholic or Episcopalian, I would recite it now, but it's been a long time since I've been in a church, so I don't really remember it. And the standardization, this council also saw the standardization of the contents of what we now call the Bible. That is, the various texts that were floating around are reduced to the 72 texts of the Old Testament, and the 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the various letters, and then the Apocalypse of John. With some texts being still disputed. There's a couple of things that the Catholic tradition accepts and various other ones don't. Anyway, the kind of real thing to take away from that, though, is that Christianity is being slowly wrapped into the structures of the Roman Empire. This is what we call the age of, patristic thought, The patristic means fatherly. It's the people the first theologians of the Roman Empire. This is from a roughly 200 with a guy named Tertullian in the Latin tradition, or 100 if you start with Ignatius in the Greek tradition. Usually ends with the life of the Venerable Bede in the 8th century. It's kind of the end of the patristic period. Of these patristic authors, the most important to know about is this guy. His name is Augustine of Hippo. Hippo is a small town is a large town in Christian North Africa, in Roman North Africa. On the left, you have a Renaissance painting of him. On the right, you have probably something that looks vaguely more like someone who lives in North Africa. In any case, Augustine is, again, one of the most influential, is probably the most influential post-biblical thinker in Christianity, to the point at which, when President Obama, when he was deciding to launch drones, used Augustine's theology as kind of the basis for his justification. Augustine actually has quite a lot to do with just war theory, but that is not this class. At this point, another one of these patristic figures, his name is Saint Jerome, makes a full translation of the Bible from Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, which are the original languages of the text, into Latin. And this is what we call the Vetus, the Jeromine Vulgate. This is what we call the Jeromine Vulgate. Other previous translations were floating around of various books and things, because you usually wouldn't have a full Bible. You'd have like this book and this book and this book, and those would be different scrolls that you would carry to different places. Those we call the Vetus Latina, the old Latin text. So Jeromine Vulgate is the standard texts. This is the standard biblical text from. It takes a while to be adopted. So from, let's say, about 600 to 700 up to the very end of the 16th century when Pope Clement revises it. And then you have the Clementine Vulgate. In any case, but as we talked about before, the balance of Roman power in the late antiquity shifts strongly to the east. It moves from Rome to Constantinople, and the church is much the same. As you can see from behind me, there are kind of 5 patriarchs, as it were, of the church: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And 4 of them are in the Eastern Mediterranean, and 1 of them is in the Western Mediterranean. And even the center of the Latin church, that is to say, kind of the Western church that speaks Latin rather than the Eastern church which speaks Greek, is North Africa, where Augustine is living, rather than the Italian peninsula, because the Italian peninsula is just being torn apart by war in this period. And the major kind of thing that's happening to the church in this patristic period is theological controversy, mostly about the nature of Christ and his divinity. And this is a tedious subject, but we're going to touch on it very briefly. I'm sorry. The 2 major kind of heresies, the things that did not end up winning. The first is called Arianism, after Arius, who is the person who's said to have thought of it, says that Jesus is both created by and distinct from God the Father. This Arianism is very popular among the Gothic tribes, that is to say the rulers of the Italian peninsula, France, and Spain, and Iberia, and North Africa. To a degree, it's popular among non-Romans, or people who are calling themselves barbarians. And also among the emperors in the 4th century, although that they kind of shift off of that. The other kind of thing that these patristics authors are writing about is something called Gnosticism. Gnosis means just knowledge. And it's a later term which has been used to describe wisdom-based approaches to the divine, often conflated with also dualistic approaches to the divine, that is to say, 2 equal and opposite gods fighting each other. The best example of Gnostic literature that is well known is probably the Gospel of John, which begins, "In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," which makes no sense. It's not that it's mystical. And this would be compared to the beginning of either the Gospels of Matthew or the Gospels of Luke, which start out with a genealogy of Jesus's parents. On Joseph's side, his father's side, which is weird because his father is God, right? Anyway, whatever. It's fine. Note, however, that both these terms, Arianism and Gnosticism, are used to describe, are both terms used by the eventual quote-unquote Orthodox victors to describe their opponents. By the 5th century, most of the empire, so over a century after Constantine converts, most of the empire is kind of Nicene Christian, with the Visigoths, which are the rulers of Spain and North Africa, being the notable exception, still being Arian. The two major debates in this period are ones that will continue to haunt, I think. The first is the emperor subject to the church, or is the church subject to the emperor? The emperor certainly thought he was in charge of the church, and he had the soldiers. The other fight, so he was kind of a pretty clear victor in this period, wouldn't stay that way. The other fight is whether or not the Patriarch of Constantinople or the Patriarch of Rome was the head of the church. The fact that the imperial center was in Constantinople was a significant boost to Rome's case, of course. To Constantinople's case, of course. Rome and Constantinople are, as I said before, two of the 5 patriarchal sees: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. And again, the balance of the church is in the East and Greek. Rome, nevertheless, was nominally considered, what is the Latin term is primum inter pares, first among equals. So sort of like, the prestigious position, the person who makes sure everyone kind of settles into the council, but does not run it. Much in the way, actually, kind of the vice president and the Senate work a little bit. It gains prestige for the first time. The papacy really kind of enters the world stage, as limited as this world is, with the papacy of Leo I, who dies in 461. He makes two important contributions. The first being, he proposes something called the hypostatic union at the Council of Chalcedon, which all it means is he says, why don't we say that Jesus was 100% God and 100% man at the same time? And everyone's like, oh, that makes sense. Let's do that. Well, some people say, we'll get back to that. Most people agree with him. And then the other thing he does is he talks Attila the Hun out of invading Italy in 457. And here behind me, you see a 19th century depiction of this. The Pope would never have worn that hat in this period of time, nothing of this is historical. I just like it because Leo looks like a crazy old man, and here Attila the Hun just looks like he's just tired of dealing with this crazy old man. Anyway, it's a good picture. And then the Western Roman Empire falls. And Italy itself is overrun by 2 Gothic tribes, the Ostrogoths and the Lombards. Here you see some Goths. You can tell because they're talking in Gothic. The Ostrogoths are Arians, and they're ruling around Rome. So this is a little bit of a problem. In France, the Franks are the kind of the barbarian tribe, quote unquote, that invades France. The Franks are nominally pagan. The Clovis, their king Clovis I, is said to have been baptized by a guy named Saint Remigius, of whom the city of Reims is in northern France is named. The collapse of the empire brings with it the collapse, in the West at least, it causes the breakdown of the Roman bureaucracy with all these invasions. And the breakdown in bureaucracy means that there's a breakdown in the schooling system and therefore a general breakdown in learning. This will become important later. The Pope in Rome struggles with all the responsibility, all this responsibility and kind of heavy without the Byzantine Empire there's no soldiers, right? The Byzantine Emperor won't send soldiers over to help the Pope, but he also still will send soldiers over to arrest the Pope occasionally. So we have this guy, Gregory the Great, Gregory the First, who dies in 604, getting his head pecked by the Holy Spirit, who, for example, is very successful in kind of consolidating power in the West. He sends a mission to the British Isles to convert them to Christianity, they having been conquered by the Angles and the Saxons at about 400. Were at that point pagan, with the exception of Ireland. Very important. We'll get back to that. He extends papal authority to the West, brings Christian practice, brings West Roman practice, right, to the Arians, Lombards, and Visigoths, and also brings the Franks into Rome. Kind of Roman practice. On the other hand, the empire is still very present. One of Gregory's successors, Pope Martin I, who dies in 655, so maybe 50 years after, opposes the current emperor who's a monophysite, who says, no hypostatic union with Christ being 100% God and 100% man. Christ is just 100% God-man. And people died over that. Anyway, so the emperor is a monophysite, 100% God-man, and the Pope is a hypostatic union, 100% and 100%. The emperor has the Pope arrested, tried in Constantinople, nearly has him executed before some of the Pope's friends intervene. Instead, he is exiled and dies in exile within 6 months, so maybe poisoned. In this period from 500 to 800, as power has fragmented across the empire, particularly across the Western Empire, two major forces develop in the churches in the West specifically. One is the bishops, the power of bishops, local bishops, who often maintained isolated nodes of Roman state structures. They maintained schools within the cathedral, which they ran, centers of learning, centers of power. The other is the rise of what we now call monasticism. And these two forces, the bishops on one hand and the monks on the other, roughly map onto the kind of priest-prophet dichotomy in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, with one being the ones who channel God, or who have the kind of the sacral power to bless people, and the other ones kind of being directly inspired, right? One through ceremony, the other through prophecy. The first monk is generally considered Anthony of Egypt, who supposedly died in 356, that's the 4th century, at the ripe old age of 105. And I wanted a picture of him looking crazier than this, but this is the only one I could find. Anyway, more or less about Anthony's religious devotion, his effect on religious devotion next week, but basically he was a solitary hermit in a desert, which does not necessarily mean sand. A sandy place just means a place without people. Fighting demons, engaging in self-denial. Around him gathers a small community of similar hermits who looked to Anthony as a teacher, but this was not organized. There's no real buildings. Most akin to, if you know the biblical story, John the Baptist, who wandered around wearing animal skins and eating wild honey and locusts. He's a model of devotion and holiness in the absence of easily accessible martyrdom. You can no longer, Christianity is a Roman religion now, you can't just go to your local magistrate and go, I am a Christian, throw me to the lions, because they'd be like, okay, sure, you can be a Christian now. And in this case, Anthony is really placing himself outside of humanity. And the Latin word sacer, which we translate as sacred, really just means inhuman. More divine, whether that be plus or minus, heaven or hell, just inhuman. And so none of the factors of what we think of as monks now, so robes, rules, and a kind of a community enclosed by a wall, is in any way from Anthony in the desert. It's instead actually from Ireland. Ireland is the only part of the British Isles to remain Christian after the islands were abandoned by the Roman Empire circa 400. It's this isolated at the edge of the world, and so Irish Christianity kind of in this remote isolation got a bit weird. I love this passage. He took a handful of water to put on his face. One of his men stopped him. "O king," he said, "do not put that water on your face." "Why?" asked the king. "I am ashamed to say," said he. "What shame do you have in telling the truth?" asked the king. "This is it," he replied. "The clergy's privy is over that water." "It is there," asked the king, "that the cleric himself goes to defecate?" "It is indeed," said the youth. "Not only," said the king, "shall I put it upon my face, but I shall also put it in my mouth, and I shall drink of it." He drinks 3 mouthfuls of it, "for the water into which his feces go is a sacrament to me." That was told to Muru, and he thanked God that Aed Alan had such faith. Then he summoned Aed Alan to him. Aed Udranacht was another one of his names, and Muru said to him, "Dear son, as a reward for that reverence you have given to this church, I promise, as in God's witness, that you will take the kingship of Ireland shortly, and then die of hepatitis." This is very typical of Irish Christianity. Kind of just magical Jesus wizards. Monks is they're wizards. Like, there's no differentiation between like Gandalf and a saint, really. An Irish saint in the Irish model. Anyway, so that's a taste of the weirdness that's going to come. But in the late 6th century, an Irish missionary by the name of Columbanus, Columbanus travels to Merovingian France and Lombard Italy and establishes monasteries on the Irish model with the robes and the community and the rule in 2 places, one in kind of northern France called at Luxeuil, and another in northern Italy called Bobbio. And here we see the result is an explosion of interest in this sort of life, religious life. It expands rapidly. Monasteries of this nature expand rapidly across all of Western Europe. There aren't any in Spain because, of course, Spain is now Muslim. We see the development of many different rules for monastic life. There's little standardization between these. We can't talk about a monastic order in this period. This is also the point where the dominant monastic rule, which is called, to say, the rule of Saint Benedict, Saint Benedict of Nursia, comes out. But only like 1 or 2 monasteries kind of follow it, and it's more like a descriptive thing of what you should do rather than a prescriptive thing of you must follow this. The monasteries in the Irish tradition also preserve most of the texts we have from antiquity. This is sort of accidental. They needed to learn Latin and therefore kept the books around to do it. This should cause resonances when you read the Canticle for Leibowitz. These monasteries became important political and economic centers in turn. There were some reforms under Emperor Charlemagne, and some standardization of rules under one of his reformers named of Benedict of Amiens. Not the same as Benedict of Nursia. That's very confusing. I have already covered most of the developments circa 800 to 1100, which is to say the investiture contest, the dissolute nature of the 10th century papacy, the Great Schism between East and West in 1045, or 1054, excuse me. But one thing I want to add to that is the rise of a different kind of monasticism, which is Cluniac monasticism, established at the monastery of Cluny, shockingly, in 910. And this is a system where one monastery oversees others, which is the first kind of standardization of rules and practices across a variety of monasteries. And here you can see all the monasteries under Cluniac affiliation. From the late 11th century, from the period that roughly coincides with the beginning of the Crusades, there is a general growth in popular enthusiasm, popular among the people, for a religious-ish life. And it's unclear whether or not the Crusades themselves kick-started it or they were tapping into this. We see this in a lot of different ways, one of which is the explosion of several new monastic orders. The Premonstratensians are one. The Carthusians, if you've ever had green chartreuse, that's Carthusians. They made that. And the Order of Cistercians, which is my personal thing I study, This is the map of Cistercian monasteries. So as you can see, this is an order of magnitude, even from this. There's an order of magnitude in number and scale across most of Europe, east and west. The ones, of course, in Syria and Istanbul are ones that were founded with the Crusade and died with it. This is a period with a growing concern over not so much orthopraxy, because we've already kind of established that, to say the standardization of religious practice, because these orders start to standardize that, but a growing concern over orthodoxy. That is standardization of belief, and a growing awareness of heresy, which we've talked about a little bit. This coincides with a desire for a religious life as a popular option, something called the Vita Apostolica, which is Latin for apostolic life. And the line between heretic and orthodox is very, very narrow. Some of you may know the story of St. Francis, who is a beggar who asks for permission to preach, and he's granted it. And however, maybe, 30 years before Francis asks for permission to preach and founds his Franciscan order, which still exists, a guy named Waldo, or Valdense, whatever you want to call him, where's Waldo, asks the Pope for the same thing, and the Pope says no. And he says, well, never mind then, I'm just going to do it anyway. And he's a heretic, and the Valdensians are actually still a heretical sect today. Well, according to the Catholic Church, they exist. They don't think of themselves as heretics. This is also a period which sees increasing amounts of female religiosity, with new gendered forms of piety, which again discussed later. But note that there is always a reliance on a male cleric to tell the story of a holy woman, as you will see with the life of Christina the Astonishing. This is also the period which sees the formation of universities from those cathedral schools that started, that kind of kept the Roman traditions going after the fall of Rome. Most specifically, the first universities are either at Paris or Bologna. They both still fight about who was first. Paris is the center for theology, Bologna for law. The universities are revitalized by the reintroduction of Roman law texts, the codices of Justinianic law and things like that, and also the reintroduction of Aristotelian text, or Aristotle, via Muslim Iberia. This is also a period which sees a lot of, again, mysticism and calls for returns to poverty among the church, within the church. The Cluniac monks, who I mentioned before, were kind of very powerful because of this organization that they had, but they were also very rich, and they decorated themselves because they were priests of God. They wore gold, they had gold things, they ate okay. And for example, the Cistercians deliberately broke away from this other rule to say that was too luxurious and we want to do a new thing that's much more abstemious. Eventually, the result of this kind of increased calls for poverty, particularly as it abutted heretics who themselves were definitely living a apostolic life versus the luxury of monks and clerics, resulted in the two mendicant orders. The Latin verb mendicare means to beg. These are men and women, men, there are female, but they didn't let the women out. Men who were monks in vow, but lived in the world and preached to people. And they begged for they were supposed to at least beg for their, or work for their bread every single day. Their two orders that are most well known are the Franciscans, who wear the brown robes on the left, and the Dominicans, who wear the white robes with black scapular on the right. Providence College is run by the Dominicans. The Dominicans are also the ones who tend to run the Inquisitions. What else? There's a distinct parallel here, actually, to the Knights Templar, in sort of the way that the Knights Templar were a fusion of knights and monks. The mendicant orders are a fusion of kind of popular piety and monks. the heresies that appear in these periods, in this kind of later period, are concerned primarily, I think, with popular access to salvation. So those Waldensians that I mentioned, who get their start in the late 12th and 13th century, are mostly concerned with lay preaching, which is why the Franciscans particularly are also concerned with lay preaching as a way to offer an alternative to Waldensians and make up for that mistake of saying no to Waldo. But to give people religious inspiration, right, through preaching. In the 13th century, a group called the Lollards, there's unclear derivation of that name, first provide an English translation of the Bible to make the Bible readable and accessible to the common person. In the 15th century, there's the Hussites, something we're going to talk about more, but their major fight was for something called a communion of both kinds, which is to say, they're in the sacrament of communion in the Catholic Church has both bread and wine as a component, the body and blood of Christ. Usually, the people would receive just the body, there's the bread, and the priest would have the bread and the wine. This still happens in the Catholic Church. You will still see the priest basically chug the chalice of wine after handing it out to the altar staff. Except in Moravia, except in kind of the Czech Republic area where the Hussites were, they have a special set of rules that said they must get the chalice. And that's because of the Hussites. But this shows a genuine desire for genuine religious devotion, genuine religious need. This all coincides with the ascendancy of papal power, the papacy of Innocent III, who I've talked about a lot, after and kind of this height, this papal supremacy, after the investiture contests. But the 13th century is deceptively hard for the papacy. They spend a lot of it trying to break Sicily off from the Holy Roman Empire. And you may remember I said Frederick II, the guy who negotiated the return of Jerusalem in Arabic, he was born in Sicily and was the Holy Roman Empire. He ruled Naples, which is to say the boot of Italy, Sicily, and the Holy Roman Empire. Why would the popes have a problem with this? Well, they were surrounded on two. They were surrounded. There's one guy has all the territories above and below them, and he's pretty close to where they are in Rome. And they remember Martin I, right? The guy who got grabbed and beat and transported to the Holy Roman to the Byzantine Empire and died in exile. Right? They remember that. They don't want that to happen again. Most of their political aim is to stop the Holy Roman Empire from getting enough power to put the papacy underneath it. Most of the problems that resulted from this we have already covered. The papacy, as I said before, comes kind of having spent all of its time and energy fighting the Holy Roman Empire, has little left to sort of deal with France. And so the papacy comes under French control. Again, Philip le Bel has his minions nearly beat Boniface VIII to death. And the papacy moves to Avignon in the south of France. Where, again, this is the Palace du Pape in Avignon, the Palace of the Popes. When the popes attempt to return to Rome in 1373, so 70 some odd years, in what has been called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, this causes a schism. The cardinals who elect the first pope say they were intimidated by the Roman mob. They didn't want to elect that guy. They elect this other guy who is French and goes right back to Avignon, and then you have two popes. And those popes each have their own college of cardinals, and those college of cardinals continue to appoint popes after each dies. And so you have two papacies, one in Rome and one in Avignon. To resolve this can't be resolved by kind of regular political avenues, because, of course, the French are obedient to the Avignon papacy, which means that the English aren't necessarily obedient to the Roman papacy, so you just have warfare. The attempt to resolve this, the church as a body calls a general council, which is to say as many of the members of the church as possible gather together and decide what to do. And what they decide to do is to depose both of the popes, the one in Rome and the one in Avignon, and to appoint a new one. And of course, as you would expect, there are now 3 popes, because the other 2 said, screw you. This repeats one more time, and then there are 4 popes. Finally, enough of them die. One of them is captured and imprisoned. And this resolves, and in 1422, Martin V is elected. He dies in 1431. And Martin then immediately crushes the reforming councils, which tells you, it's a little pattern that will, happens with reformers there. Just elect me. I'll make everything better. Squash. All this, the 2 papacies, new palace in Avignon, is very, very expensive, right? And so we have the rise in the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries of something called papal fiscalism. More and more legal appeals are routed to Rome and the papacy, which creates an incredible bureaucracy and brings a lot of money in, because you got to pay for your court appeals. Basically, any case anywhere in Europe can be appealed to Rome for judgment. And people do if you have enough money, because if your opponent doesn't, you win. The other way that the papacy got a lot of money fast was through the sale of this, which is a papal indulgence. So the papacy in this period came up with a theological construction which they call the Treasury of Merit, which says that the apostles, the followers of Jesus, and the saints and the martyrs in the Catholic tradition all were so good, they had way more goodness than was necessary to get into heaven. And so that excess, that largesse, is in the control of the church and the papacy, and the Pope can distribute it at his will. So in exchange for a few coins, you can buy one of these, which hot off the printing press, the brand new printing press, fill in your name here, and it will relieve you of some portion of the punishment due to you for your sins. This is a major complaint for Martin Luther, among others, when the Protestant Reformation comes around. And Renaissance Italy, the rise of Renaissance Italy in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, right? This art, this resurgence of art and culture and sculpture and within Italy is both beautiful, but also incredibly expensive, and the popes are no different than any other secular prince in trying to to beautify their surroundings. For example, this is the Lateran Palace, the Lateran Basilica. This is where, well, the front facade is newer, but this was the home of the papacy for 1,500 years, 1,460 years. Until the Renaissance. This is, of course, St. Peter's. This is the home of the papacy now. They built this in the 15th century, 16th century. That's not cheap, right? It looks like this inside. This is all stuff that was pretty much done by the time of the Protestant Reformation. This was expensive. All the money is going to Rome. Everyone knows it. Furthermore, papal attempts to consolidate their political power in Italy, those fights with the Holy Roman Empire we talked about, make them look just like another prince, right? Just another guy fighting his enemies in Italy. There's a lot of them. And so, in a way, what the papacy has done from about 1100 to about 1500 is to gain power at the expense of their authority. Right? They have more and more and more money, and more people acknowledge their ability to do something, but their justifications for being able to do that get less and less and less. We see Jan Hus, who led the Hussite rebellion the one about the communion of both kinds, he actually is kind of early 15th century. He actually seems like a proto-Martin Luther in so many ways. The difference is that the papacy said, "Oh, Jan Hus, yes, your ideas are interesting, and we are also concerned with this. Why don't you come to this church council? We offer you safe conduct." And Jan said, "Oh, well, good. I'm glad you want to hear my ideas. I'll come to that church council." And so he did, and then they arrested and executed him. And 100 years later, when they said, "Oh, Martin Luther, we are interested in your ideas. Why don't you come to this church council?" Martin Luther said, no, and went and hid in his ally's castle. So by 1500, you have a Catholic Church that is immensely powerful, right? Although there are stirrings of rebellion and problems, and there was this whole thing in Avignon, still, the Catholic Church of 1500, immensely powerful. It is already losing direct authority. It's kind of ceded authority over the churches in France and Spain to the respective monarchs. So it's losing, so that authority is being chipped away. It is certainly seen as deeply corrupt and money hungry. Attempts to reform it, those councils, have failed spectacularly, or in the case of the Hussites, violently. And the stage is set for the Protestant Reformation. But you have to learn about that from someone else. Next lecture, we're going to talk about medieval devotion. See you then.